If you are an influencer, if you have a side hustle, if you've got something supplementing your income, this video is for you. I spoke to an attorney that's going to help you structure your business a little bit more and tell you why you need to incorporate your business, get all of the lovely tax benefits and the legal protection that you should be getting within a corporate structure. So join me in conversation with Marcus. Okay, cool. Marcus, welcome to the Wealth Nation podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So we're going to talk today about business, how it's going to work, pros and cons. But before we get started with our questions, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm an attorney, a commercial and corporate attorney working in Cape Town. I'm at a firm called Fairbridges Wertheim Becker.
Mhm.
And yeah, I've been here for a few years. I did my articles here and I'm a senior associate now in the commercial department.
Nice. So I have plenty of clients, and everybody's keen
Yeah.
on business. They understand the entrepreneurial space, want to start making some good money, but a lot of folks are at this point where they're running as sole props.
Yeah.
And at what point or what should their thinking process be when it comes to registering a business?
Yeah. I mean, obviously I think it's important just to kind of clarify what the different options are, right? So when you're starting off, it's easier just to be you doing the business, right? That's essentially what a sole proprietor is.
Yeah.
You are an individual and you are responsible for every part of the business. The business is essentially you. Where we start talking about incorporating a business, that comes into play where you create a company and the company then runs the business.
Mhm.
And there's a couple of different things to take into consideration. Primarily, I think the first thing to think of is whether your business requires it in the first place. You know, a lot of sole proprietors, it's fine. You know, if you're selling something, you're selling flowers on the side of the street, you don't need a company to do that. You
Yeah.
can be the business. There's no problems there. Where you potentially start running into more formal settings, call it, you might want to consider incorporating a company because you can enter into contracts more easily, and it gives you certain protections.
All right.
So, I mean, just to maybe define what incorporation even means. So that's essentially when you create a separate entity, right? You create a company that's distinct from the person that runs the company. You can call them owners or we call them shareholders.
Right. And what
Okay.
different types of incorporation do we have in South Africa?
So you've got a few different types. I think the primary ones that your listeners will be familiar with are private companies and public companies.
Right.
So public companies are those big companies that you often see listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, for example. Vodacom and those kind of companies, and those have and the reason I call it public companies is because they have publicly available shares for people to buy and sell.
Hmm.
So you can decide today you want to go buy Vodacom shares. You can
Yeah.
go do that right now.
Okay.
Whereas private companies, the ownership is private and the transfer of the shares is limited. So you can't just go and buy shares in a private company. There's a limitation on those shares, and that's essentially the main difference.
Mhm.
So most companies, if you're looking at incorporating your sole proprietorship, you'll be doing that as a private company
Yeah.
where you'll be the shareholder, 100% shareholder, let's say.
Okay.
And as the business develops, you might then look for investment opportunities where you would then open those shares up to the public,
Okay.
and that would be then an IPO, but that's
That's
another level.
advanced. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of influencer clients. They have these brand deals, and they're doing posts for money. I mean, and it's becoming a career. I mean, you talk to a 4 or 5 year old, everybody wants to be a YouTuber or an influencer.
Yeah.
Is there a case for influencers to be incorporated?
So I think the biggest benefit for incorporation is the fact that you're essentially separating yourself from the business. So as a business, you are entering into different agreements where you're creating certain obligations or liabilities that you need to comply with, right? And if you fail to comply with those, you essentially have a liability for that.
Right.
And where you have a company, it's the company itself that's liable. So you're essentially that you put a screen in front of you to say that you can go for the company, but you can't come for me.
Yeah.
Okay. So, obviously if you're thinking about it from, a personal perspective, or let's say you have a family or something and you have personal assets.
Yeah.
You have a family car, for example. If I'm a sole proprietor and let's use your example, I'm an influencer and I enter into an agreement, I run into some kind of trouble, or I don't make a payment I need to make, and then they pursue that legally.
Yeah.
If they get a judgment against me, they can come for my assets.
Yeah.
Which means they can, get the sheriff to attach my car and sell that car in order to get their money.
Right.
And now very simple example, but now I can't take my kids to school. So
Yeah.
it affects you in your personal capacity. Where you have a company, it's the company that enters into these agreements. So it's the company's liability. So when they want to go and essentially make good on that liability, they have to go for the company's assets.
Okay.
So they can't essentially go through the company to you as the individual, which offers you a level of protection.
Yeah.
So that I think is the number one reason why you should consider incorporating a company. It just gives you a bit more protection, especially if you're entering into like a wider range of agreements. And especially if you're entering into agreements with people that you don't necessarily know, which can be the case in business, right? The second reason is that it offers you better opportunities for investment.
Right.
Because when you have a company, you can, there's different forms of investment, but one of the most important ones for private companies is that I go to you, for example, and I say, I'd like you to invest in my business, and and in exchange, I'll give you a certain ownership stake in my business. So I'll basically give you shares in my company in exchange for your investment, and then you'll be a shareholder. And that's an easier thing to do than for me to just go and say, in my individual capacity, can you give me some money? People like to know that they have something to kind of hold on to, something of value. So I'd say those are kind of the two main reasons. On another level, if you're an incredibly successful influencer, there might be certain tax benefits. So, if you're making an income as an influencer in your own individual capacity, your income will be subject to income tax, which we all know. If the company is earning the income, the company is liable for a corporate income tax. Right. The corporate income tax is about 27%, or is 27%, and your income tax is a sliding scale. So it varies depending on how much you're earning. So if you're earning a very small amount, you might be liable for less than 27% tax, at which point, it's tax beneficial not to have a company. Right. But if you're all of a sudden earning in your personal capacity an amount that means that you're taxed at 45%, then it makes sense to have that income come into a company where you're only taxed at 27%.
Okay. All right. A lot of us get into business because of cash flow, right? But when you have this legal entity, there's an asset value that's in there that's slowly building. You have its brand, you're building systems, you're building processes. Maybe you hire 1-2 people and it's an income for them now. In terms of that asset value and in terms of passing away, because we can't say the D word on social media, the video gets flagged, right? What happens? What's the benefit of the business as opposed to the sole proprietor?
Yeah, so that's also very interesting. So another benefit of a company is that it has what you call perpetual existence.
Right.
Okay. So if I'm a shareholder or a director in my company and I pass away, I might have other shareholders and directors, but let's say it's just me. The company continues to exist.
Right.
But if it's a sole proprietor, then the business essentially dies with me. Okay. So, and especially if you're getting into the position where you're employing people, it adds an awful lot of certainty when you have a company, as opposed to if it's just me, but even with a company, you need to have a form of succession planning in place. Right. We've had a lot of cases where, entrepreneurs do exactly that, where they incorporate a company, and it's them as a sole director, sole shareholder, and they die. And And it's very difficult to move from one day to the next as a kind of a running business or a going concern when the main person who kind of is running the show all of a sudden passes away. So there is a level of succession planning that has to happen in a company as well, but the company can continue, whereas the business will pass with the person if it's a sole proprietorship.
Right. So for the people that are listening or watching us right now and they're in business and they don't know at what point should they transition to be incorporated, what should they be thinking? Do they have to earn a certain level of income? Must they be employing a certain number of people? What check boxes they need to be to say, right, now is the time for us to incorporate?
I'd say an important one is once you want to access external capital. So if you want investment, and that goes one of two ways. We discussed it briefly. If I want to approach an investor and offer them essentially a share in the business, it's better to do that as a company. It's more attractive to an investor. Investors want certainty. They don't want things that can change very quickly. A company is a structure that is certain. So that's useful for them. The second way of accessing money is through debt financing. And debt financing is, you approach a bank, for example, and you get a loan. Right. And again, banks like to work. Banks are, of course, very risk averse. Yeah. They also like to work with companies and entities that they can trust. So I'd say as a starting point, that's a very important consideration. Once you start wanting to take other people's money into the business, that's probably something you need to think about. But another thing to think about is if you want to start employing people, right. You're again offering a certain level of kind of certainty and structure to your employees if they know that a company's looking after them, and obviously the flip side of that then is if you incorporate a company, you also need to be ready to deal with the administration of that company, right? Whether it's filing, pays your tax returns or whatever it may be. There is basically a general upkeep for the company. It's not particularly complex, but it's something that needs to be done. Yeah. Whereas if you're a sole proprietor, there's more room to wing it. Let's say. Is it
a laborious task to be incorporated in South Africa?
Actually, it's incredibly easy. So there's a couple of things to think about, but in general, you can be incorporated from one day to the next. What you do is you essentially file for incorporation at the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, the CIPC, and I think if for a basic one, it's about 125 rand. Okay. So it's also very cheap to do it, and you can get incorporated within 48 hours. And then it just depends on whether you want certain levels of complexity within your business. But we can incorporate you on a very basic level within a couple of days, and very cost effectively. And what they'll do is they'll issue you with incorporation documents, so your notice of incorporation. They'll set out who your first directors are, so that will be your incorporator. So if you decide to go and incorporate your business now, the incorporator and first director will be Yolanda. And then you'll get those documents, and you'll get what's called a memorandum of incorporation. Okay. And the memorandum of incorporation is a document that every company needs to have, and it sets out kind of the very basic governance principles of that company. Okay. Including kind of how many shares can be are authorized for issue and that kind of thing. You can also, with the CIPC, reserve a name. So if you have a particular name that you want for your company, you issue your preferences in order. I think they ask for 3. And then if your first one's available or doesn't kind of clash with any registered trademarks, then that's the name. Otherwise, you can get a standard company name, which is essentially a form of your registration number, Pty Limited, and you can start tomorrow. Okay, interesting. And what about the upkeep? The annual reports from a tax perspective, like UIF.
like all these nitty-gritties, what's involved in these annual compliance requirements?
Yeah. So so let's go from our basic example first. On our basic example, you'll have because you can incorporate a company and it can sit for a while. Maybe you're not earning an income yet. At that point, you'll have an annual return that's due to the CIPC. It's based off turnover to a certain extent, but I think if you have no turnover, I think it's about 400 grand a year.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's kind of your very basic level. As your company grows and you have more obligations, you might have employees, for example, in which case you'll have UIF and you'll have pay as you earn, which are pay as you earn or returns you're just going to have to file with SARS, and if you have VAT returns that you need to file, obviously taxes are an administrative burden that you then don't get around. So I'd say probably that is the most difficult thing to do. Other than that, it's fairly straightforward. Once you start bringing in other investors and you have different shareholders in place, maybe you have you're not the only director, then it makes sense to start maybe thinking about having agreements between the shareholders, so shareholders agreements, which will govern the relationship between the owners of the company, and all of these things, they might seem unnecessary at a certain stage, especially if you're going into business with people you know and trust. But the reason you have these agreements is that hopefully you prepare them and you put them in a drawer and you never look at them again.
Yeah.
But people go into business with friends and family all the time, and you want to, if unfortunately things go wrong, you want to be able to pull that document out and make sure that you are protected. So I'd say that's probably the
All right.
largest extent of it.
So folks that are already incorporated,
Yes.
and find, a lot of the time somebody passes on, and now what happens? And we spoke about this a little bit earlier. What should the thinking point be around succession planning for businesses?
So in your you can do it in your memorandum of incorporation.
Yeah.
So as I said, you'll get a standard form MOI from the CIPC when you register your business, but you can also have a customized MOI, which needs to have certain kind of minimum requirements, but it's essentially you can decide what you want to have in there as long as it complies with the Companies Act. And in that document, for example, you could say, I'm the director of the company, and if I pass, then you can have an alternate director who will step into my shoes. That's, for example, is a useful thing to have. People don't always think about it, but from one day to the next, you need to have somebody that can make the operational decisions of the business.
Yeah.
Because in a company, you'll have the owner, who's the shareholder, and then you have the directors, and the directors are responsible for kind of the day-to-day running of the business. And the shareholders and directors can be completely different people, or they can be the same person. But the point is, if the person that's running your company all of a sudden passes away, you want to know that there's somebody that's going to be able to step into their shoes fairly quickly. Alternatively, the shareholders can appoint a new director, and that's a fairly seamless process. But you have to have your resolutions and everything in place. And again, all of these things, they get more and more complicated as there's more and more people involved in the company and the company gets bigger and bigger. When it's like your standard kind of 2 directors, 2 shareholders, it's a little bit easier. But the reason succession planning is also important is if you have a situation where, let's say you and I go into business together, we're both shareholders, we're both directors, and I pass away. If let's say I've passed my share of my company on to my children, but they don't really know much about the business. If I haven't made a plan for somebody to come in who has a bit of know-how about them to help run the business, then and you have, let's say, not the best intentions after my passing, then it leaves my half of the business in a very vulnerable position, and that's something you want to protect from. And if you have alternate directors, for example, then it's a fairly automatic process.
All right. So, but what if it's just the one person who's director, who's shareholder, and if we don't have that succession and plan in place, that's it. That's the end.
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. So, and the reason it's difficult is because your shares are your assets. So that will form part of what is in your estate, which will pass on to your heirs. But which in theory is fine because your heir then becomes a shareholder and you can appoint a director, and that sounds great until you realize that estate winding up an estate can take an unbelievable amount of time,
Right.
and it can be very complicated. And it's as with everything, if you think about it ahead of time, it can be very seamless. But if you're in it, especially you can't discount the fact that those people are then in a very emotional moment as well. So
Right.
it's difficult to think clearly and or that you just leave yourself in a position where you're in a bit of limbo. And hopefully that doesn't happen. But if you're waiting for the estate to be wound up in order to move forward with a new shareholder and appoint a new director, that can be incredibly difficult.
All right. Well, Marcus, I think that's all the questions I have for you today. Any parting shots from you?
Nothing from me. No, just to say thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
And if anybody that's listening and one has more questions for you or really keen on getting incorporated, what support services do you provide?
So we do. We work kind of with companies all day, every day.
Yeah.
But I think if you are interested in incorporating a company, you can contact me. I can give you my contact details, or
Sure, go ahead.
so
Share it online, or I'll even put it in the show notes so people
yeah,
can
I think let's do
more
that, and then yeah, we can set up a consult and we can decide what's best for you. There are, as we discussed, kind of different levels of complexity here. So if it's a one-stop shop, you just want to get something incorporated to create a certain level of protection for yourself, then we can do that very easily. And what we also do then is essentially we can help with the company administration during the company's lifetime, because obviously that's something that we deal with all the time. But if this is the first time you're doing it, it's nice to have someone kind of holding your hand through the process. And then we're also there's also kind of the end of the company life cycle where you wind the company down, and you deregister with the CIPC, and we can help you with that as well. And in general, any company secretarial services in between.
Oh, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Marcus. Your time has been valuable. Learned a lot. Hopefully we can have you online again.